In this lesson, we'll be looking at multiplying and dividing rational expressions. Now, because rational expressions are so similar to fractions, the same way that we multiply and divide fractions is what we'll be doing here as well. So remember that when you're multiplying fractions, you multiply the numerators together and then multiply the denominators together. So basically you multiply across the top and then across the bottom. So if I have something like 3 over 4 times 1 over 2, okay, so multiplying across the top, the numerators, 3 times 1 is 3, 4 times 2 is 8, and that's it. Now in terms of dividing fractions, what we want to do is we want to flip the second fraction, or take the inverse of it, and then we're going to multiply. And this works because dividing is the opposite of multiplying. So taking the same two fractions that I had, 3 over 4, now if I want to divide that by a half, first thing I would do is I would flip the second fraction, and now this turns into multiplication, so it turns into 2 over 1. Now I can multiply across the top is 6, multiply across the bottom is 4, so I get 6 over 4. Now just to make sure that I have a proper solution, we should always make sure our answers are reduced. So this would reduce to 3 over 2. So we can do the same thing with rational expressions, but step number 1, we should get into the habit of simplifying both expressions first. This is going to make our jobs a lot easier for some of the questions. And then after multiplying, we can simplify our final answer again, just like I simplified the previous answer that I had, and we do that by canceling out any common factors that may now exist. Alright, so I'm going to simplify this expression right here. So 6v over 10v squared times 10 over 5v. And then we'll also state any restrictions on the variable, just like when we're simplifying. Now, step number 1, it's not totally necessary for this question, but just get into the habit of it. I'm going to simplify each expression first. So 6v over 10v squared. What I can do here is I can factor something out of the top and bottom. So both of these, top and bottom, can be divided by 2v. So I'd be left with a 3 on top, and if I factor a 2v out of the denominator, I'm left with 5v. So we know from before that 2v divided by 2v, it cancels out because it divides to 1. Now the second expression, 10 over 5v, I would be able to factor out a 5 out of the top and bottom, so I'll be left with a 2 on top and then just v on the bottom. So then that will cancel out, it divides to 1. Alright, so now I have basically two fractions, or two rational expressions that I'm going to multiply. So I can multiply across the top, 3 times 2 is 6, over, and then 5v times v is 5v squared. Now, if this is my final answer, I'm going to take a look at it and I'm going to think, can I reduce it any more? But there's nothing in common between 6 and 5v squared, so I have to leave it like that. Now, we also want to state any restrictions on the variable, and remember this will be values of the variable that would make the denominator equal to 0. So in the final answer, we can see that if v is 0, that would make the denominator 0, so we don't want that to happen. Now, make sure that you check all of your steps, and also all of the denominators. So having v 0 here would make this denominator 0. Same thing over here, but I don't see any other values that would make the denominator 0, so that is the only restriction that I have. Alright, so looking at something a little more interesting now. So when we have trinomials, we're going to factor them, and remember, we want to simplify each expression first before we do the multiplication. So hopefully some of the binomials will cancel out and we'll be left with something much simpler. Now at this point we should be pretty comfortable with factoring, so I'm just going to skip ahead and factor both of these expressions quickly. Alright, so here are both expressions fully factored, and what I can see in my first expression over here is that I have m plus 9 as a factor in the numerator and m plus 9 as a factor in the denominator, so Those will cancel out, they divide to 1. So I'm left with m minus 3 times m minus 7. Now over on this side, m minus 8 will cancel out m minus 8, so I'm left with m minus 4 times m minus 3. So now that I've simplified both expressions, now I can just multiply it. Now I don't actually want to use FOIL here and expand at all. I don't want to further complicate things, so I'm just going to write it as m minus 3 times m minus 4 over, and then multiplying the denominators, m minus 7 times m minus 3. So by not expanding it, by keeping everything as binomials, I now see that m minus 3 can cancel out because it's common factors on both the numerator and denominator. So now we're left with our final answer, m minus 4 over m minus 7. Nothing else I can do here to simplify. Now in terms of restrictions, we're going to check all the way from the solution and up to see what will make the denominator 0. So in the solution we see m minus 7, so that means m cannot be 7. Also looking at the second last step here, we still have the binomial m minus 7, so 7 is a restriction. We also have the binomial m minus 3, so if m is equal to 3, that binomial becomes 0, and therefore the whole denominator. Also looking at the first step, we have m minus 3, but we already have 3. We also have m minus 8, so positive 8 is a restriction. Over here we have 7, and then we also have m plus 9, so that means minus 9 is a restriction. So 1, 2, 3, 4 restrictions for that. Always make sure that you start at the bottom and work your way up to catch those restrictions.